Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, though I am disappointed that I'm not there in person. I've actually been to India about a dozen times, and one of some of the most wonderful work that I've done with families and some of the most interesting, wonderful times I've had traveling in India. But I'm going to tell you a story, take you on a quick journey, a story of 100 families that are all over the world, and how they grew and evolved, and what they do together to be succeed as 100-year family enterprises. This journey began about 7 years ago when I made a very, very good career move. I retired. And there I was. I had been a professor for 38 years, and all of a sudden, my life was open. I could do whatever I want. And there were a couple of things. I'd been involved in family business. There was a couple of things that I was really interested in and concerned about. And one is that a lot of family business knowledge comes from the West, and I was interested in. I knew that family businesses exist all over the world, and I wondered if they had any commonalities and if some of the wisdom that consultants have been preaching really made sense. And the other thing I wanted to do is to see and validate just what are the best families doing. So I began to do a research study and travel around the world. I traveled around the world a couple of times over the last 7 years, and I've interviewed more than 100 families. What I wanted to do, is look at the families that were most successful. So the first challenge I had is, how do I define that? And how do I find them? It's easy to find families that are in conflict because they're all in the news, but it seems that the families that are really successful also tend to be somewhat quiet and private. They don't seek notoriety, and they aren't out there as much. So the families I was looking for were families that were successful in past the third generation. Of control and ownership. They had successful, not just a single business, but as we see, many of them had evolved from a single business to multiple businesses. So I'm not studying a family business, I'm studying what we call family enterprise, which is the different assets and business endeavors of a family over generations. They had created value and had successful families. The average net worth of the families that I interviewed was a little bit less than $1 billion US a year. So they were huge. They didn't start out that way. These families had a shared identity as not just a business. They weren't just business partners, they were a family. So I looked at them, and I studied 100 families in 20 countries, and the research is continuing. So a little bit more than half are from the US, but as we continue to interview families where we want the US families to be 40% and to really represent more and more global families. Why study family business? What is it about it? And there are two things about family business that I think make a family business absolutely fundamentally different than public corporations. Because the first, for two reasons. The first is the owners of the family business are not strangers to each other. The owners of a public company have nothing in common. They all want to see the business make money, but they're not really heavily committed to it. In a family business, the owners have a personal relationship, and because they have that relationship, they care about more than money. So money is important, but money is important in the context of other things that make for a meaningful life. So the owners are connected, and they have a special relationship as family. Second thing is they want, as the title of my book says, they want to pass the business on to their children, their grandchildren, and successive generations. So they consider themselves stewards, sustaining the business for multiple generations, and they're looking to the future and not at short-term returns. So this is a great model for business, and one of the things that I've seen is that family business is a real model for responsible and sustainable business, and one that we're starting to learn from. So first of all, 100 families, 20 countries, all kinds of businesses, every kind of business: manufacturing, service, land, real estate, ranching, farming, every kind of business, all the different countries and cultures. So first of all, let me just say it's a great surprise that there were any commonalities at all. And yet in my study, I found some very, very strong commonalities and shared activities, initiatives, and endeavors that these families all had that seemed to be connected to their success over many generations. First big finding was that all of these families seem to have made two major choices, or two major successes. And the first one is the founders built a great enterprise. They usually started a business. The business was successful, created wealth greater than any individual could use. And that was the first step. But what these families did in the second and third generation is what was important. They took the wealth, they built upon the wealth, and they decided, after asking the question, well, what is this wealth for? They made a decision to create a great family. And this was an investment. This was when they had their wealth, they said, what's it for? And what they wanted to do was create a great family. And that means putting resources into it, not necessarily because if you have a great family, you'll produce more money, but because they had a lot of wealth, they said, what's meaningful for us to do? Now, when I started studying families and I started interviewing them, I would ask them things about the family, and they would come back to me with kind of a question, well, what do you mean by family? And I thought it was obvious. But they said, well, do you mean my family, my immediate family, maybe my parents, my spouse, my children? That's my nuclear family. But also, we're a family in the sense that there are we're actually a tribe of families. Many families tied together by legacy issues with a shared identity. Family members may live even in different countries, but they have a shared identity and special things that they do together. They're continually reinventing themselves, but they're building on basic relationships. And what's interesting is this extended family has some features of kind of the Eastern. You have the Hindu undivided family, which is a collective family, and there are collective families in Asia. But there also are characteristics of Western individualism and self-determination. And in a way, these family tribes are a blend of East and West. But they're tribal families, and this is important to who they are. They're tied together by shared wealth, but the concerns that they have, that I heard from them, are things like, what do I do with our wealth? What kind of future? How do we raise productive children? How do we have impact on the community? Who are we? How can we be grateful and responsible for the wealth that we have? Now, what's interesting, these are their major concerns. These are not business concerns. These are personal concerns. They're asking themselves about non-financial issues. So when the family is building wealth, of course, that's important. But as they have wealth over generations, the questions that they ask become broader. And a lot of people in this field are talking about non-financial capital. And from these families, we heard about 4 particular kinds of capital value that they created beyond the financial. They created legacy capital in from their who they were, from their shared traditions, from their things that they had done in the past. Their legacy gave them value. The other source of value that they talked about is their personal relationships, the trust that they had, the shared learning that they had done, the way in which they worked together, the caring that they had for each other, and that was relationship capital, and that was really important to them. The third kind of capital is that there's the investment that they made in educating, in developing, in growing the skills and the many, many talents of the next generation. And the fourth is social capital, is the impact that they had in the community, the people that worked for them, the people in their community, the people in their village, and even a sense of connection to the whole world and a desire to create a sustainable world. So these are all the sources of value. And what these families were doing was not just looking at how capital, but just as we do, we want to of capital. And in a lot of ways, some of these other kinds of capital became major investments and activities of the families. And in other ways, having these non-financial capital helped make their businesses and the things that they did successful in the world. Other thing that I learned about these families is by the second or third generation, they weren't a single business. They weren't, if they were a single business, they weren't the business they started in. Sometimes they not just one business, but several businesses, many businesses. Sometimes they had invested in real estate, invested in different things, and they became financial families. Sometimes, very often, they had a family foundation. And so they were on a journey, and these people saw their success as continually innovating and creating value. They didn't just create value in one generation and then spend it down the next generation. Every generation was adding value, financial and non-financial value. So they saw their experience as a journey, not as a single event or a single success. Let's look at the development process. So almost all these families began as with a legacy business. They started a business. Sometimes it was land-based, sometimes it was manufacturing-based, service-based, and they had a very successful business. And that was often the first generation. And but by the second or third generation, they had several enterprises. They had what they think of as a portfolio. They often, most of the families had a family office. Even if they had their legacy business, they also had a family office for their other investments. They had real estate, they had a foundation, they had a number of other entities than just a legacy business, and they saw themselves as managing a portfolio. There are 4 kind of major changes that these families went through, and they weren't necessarily one after the other, but it's kind of a direction of their evolution. And the first thing is that as they created a successful business, money came out, either yearly profits. Sometimes there was a sale of a business creating a liquidity event, but whatever it is, the families harvested and built wealth in addition to the business and outside of the business, and they didn't just spend it, they invested it. The second thing these families reported is that each generation, the people look at each other, and there are more and more people in each generation, and they look at each other and say, well, gee, do we want to be partners? And in a large family, and this is really important, there are always some people who have a reason for not wanting to be part of it. They say, well, I love you very much, but I live in a different place, or I don't like you, and I want to do something different, or my interests are different, or my values are different. And so they all have a mechanism where either a family branch, some of them have like several family branches, and they split off and go in different directions. There's always a process for pruning the family. And so some of the families remain small in terms of owners by buying out different branches and different things. And the families are composed of people who want to be there, who aren't there as captives. They want to be there. The third thing is that they're reinventing themselves. They're diversifying, they're innovating, they're trying, and if they're not doing that, no business can just last forever and throw off cash. So they have to be reinventing themselves. And finally, they have activities, and they're increasingly active over generations to build their shared identity and do things together. So families grow as partners, they also grow as communities. So let's shift now and look at the family and how the family develops. The great fortunes all began pretty much with a single wealth creator, sometimes two, but these people are people that were not wealthy to begin with. They did not come from wealth. They were passionate about the business. They lived it almost to the exclusion of their family. They were people who had a personality style. They were in control. They would improvise and take risks and make decisions and do what they felt was right. And often, because they were successful, that proves that they were right. They also had a kind of because of their success, they were a little bit secretive. They didn't share with a lot of people. They had difficulty trusting, and so this is the personality style of the wealth creator. Now, what these families reported, and this is a kind of a common, is that there were elements and things about the wealth creator that made it difficult for them, for the wealth creator to build a family business. And in many cases, it was the second or third generation that created the family enterprise. After the success of the first generation, the second or third generation did the building of the family and the enterprise. So there are things about the wealth creator that become problems for the family. First of all, because they've been successful for many, many years, they have a sense of why change? After 20 or 30 years of success, they're not so innovative. They like the authority that they have. They like their success, and they're not open to new ideas. They have an attitude of taking that the way they can show that they care for the family is to take care of them. And the way they can take care of them is they make decisions for other people, and they see their children as eternal children, never growing up. They're not comfortable sharing information. They avoid conflict. They don't want to hear about differences in the family. And of course, they have difficulty letting go. So the very things that make for success make and create a family situation that is not where the founder is not have the skills and the self-awareness very often to create change. So the change, by and large, the development of the family enterprise is not in the first generation. First generation is not a family business. It's the intention to create a family business, but it's not a family business. Now, here's the problem. The second generation, the third generation, the children of the founder have grown up with wealth, and they have a set of challenges that they have to face, that they've been used to being taken care of and successful. How do they develop identity? what can they do that will possibly compare with what their fathers have done? They don't want to lose the money. They're afraid to trust other people. They've learned distrust from their parents. They don't want to let their parents down. They want to be treated fairly, and they have very strong ideas and sometimes very different ideas of what's fair. They don't know the rules. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They don't know. They've been trained to compete, and they don't really know how to work together. So all of these things are challenges that the next generation has to overcome. And in these families, a lot of decisions and choices got made in the second and third generation to set up a long-standing family enterprise. It was not created by the founder. What do these families do? First of all, most families, and this seems to be all over the world, don't like to talk about wealth. They don't like to talk about money. They say, well, if we don't talk about it, our kids won't be spoiled. They won't know they're rich. And what these families do is they talk about what is our wealth for? What's fair? Whose money is it? You grow up in a wealthy family. How do you know that it's not your money? What do you think is going to happen? And there are a lot of expectations that need to be exchanged, and a lot of confused feelings, and sometimes difficult feelings that the family needs to talk about. And the successful families find a way, even when there's conflict and disagreement, to talk about the money and the wealth. And this is the foundation of the change that takes place in the family culture. So in the second or third generation, all of these families reported that there was a kind of a culture change that took place within their family, from the paternalistic, controlling, secretive, distrustful style of the wealth creator. They had to redefine their family and how they worked into a partnership, where they worked as a team, where they trusted each other, where they were transparent and open, where they were explicit about the rules and what was expected, and how wealth was used. They were professional. So this is a culture change, and these families talked about a major crisis that they faced was about how to change their culture and have the old culture give way to the new culture. Let's talk about how that happens. It doesn't just happen. You can't just consultant or just to say, okay, we're now changing. There's a learning process. And what these families described was a complex social system where there were different groups of what we call stakeholders. There were the elders, and the elders had the power. They usually had the ownership. They were the people that were the creators. They had run the business. And over time, they began to bring in a group of trusted advisors, non-family managers, family office managers, investment managers, executives who were incredibly professional, incredibly competent, and attuned to carrying out the wishes of the elders. But these trusted advisors were craftsmen. They were good at business and discipline and professionalism, but they were not especially creative. Now, this is where the special nature, the special secret of the family business comes up. There's another group in the family, and they don't have any formal power. They're not owners, but they're the children, and they're the next generation, and the family invests, sends them to business school, sends them all over the world. They develop their own skills. They become digital. They grow up with all kinds of new ideas. And the next generation is a source of innovation, is a source of new ideas, but they can't express and manifest these new ideas if the advisors are running everything, if the elders are ignoring them. So these families have to create this new culture as a working partnership between the innovative ideas and the energy of the new generation, the professionalism of the trusted advisors, and the values and the dedication and the wisdom of the elders. And this is the challenge. We call this the generative alliance of all these groups working together. And the way that they work together is what we call family governance. It's governance of the business and governance of the family. The governance of the business is how do the owners oversee it? How do they reinvest? How do they make their wealth continue to work for them? And how do they operate as a business? The family part of governance is how does the family develop the next generation, develop non-financial value? And so when we talk about governance, there are 5 elements that come up over and over again. You cannot have governance without transparency, which is in the center. Transparency means the owners to be, the different groups have to know what's going on. They need information. And then with the information, the family has to create agreements on how things are done, on what are the rules, how do you make decisions, who's in charge, how do you become a board member, how do you get involved. And so this is a set of agreements, which we'll talk about later, put together in a family constitution, but with a bunch of agreements. And the question comes up, well, how do you make them happen? Who gets the family to agree to act on them? And so in order to have the agreements be living and real, the family has to have councils. They have to have groups. They have to have different entities that take on different tasks and work cooperatively. So there's transparency, there's agreements, and there are councils of family members, non-family members that work together to manage, create change, innovate, develop the business. 4th thing that they need to have are clear roles and boundaries. A family member who is a small shareholder cannot just go in the business and get a job. There are different roles: managers, family members, advisors, investment committee members, foundation. There are many, many different roles, and there are boundaries. And the family members, part of the governance is that people have to learn what they can do and what they can't do. And an owner has a lot of power, but the owner does not have infinite power. And a family member who is non-owner, but who's a next generation family member who expects to get ownership, has a special status and role and a way of becoming involved in the family. And final element of governance is accountability. People have to be accountable for results. They have to let people know what they're doing. They have to get the consent and agreement. They can't just do whatever they want. And so these 5 things make up governance. Now, what we found in these families is by the 2nd, 3rd generation, they had 2 kinds of governance. The first kind of governance is business governance, where the different enterprises are run by a board. And if you have a number of different enterprises, you can have a number of boards, and there may be a holding company for all the boards together. There may be a family office board and a business board for a public company. So there are the boards and the business governance, and then there are the owners who are between the family and the businesses. And then there is the family members, and the family has an organization, an executive team called the Family Council. And the Family Council carries out and coordinates family activities. If the family wants to meet, if the family wants to set up an educational program, a foundation, they have to have some sort of family organization separate than the business. So this is a kind of a generic model that arises in families in the 2nd, 3rd generation as they have more and more people in order to create order. One of the really exciting and new things that a family business is I think, creating is a family council, is a gathering of family members that sets up family activities, that talks about the non-financial side of the business and organizes it. And when your family is large, the chair of the family council and the family council members have a big job to do, as big a job as a board member. Some families, the head of the family council is a compensated job. They have to work half-time or a lot of work, and it's to keep the family organized, but also to deal with the family issues before they come into the business. So by developing governance, it's not these families have no conflict, it's that they manage conflict. So the family council is a big part of it. Now, the organization of the family is written down in what we call a family constitution. I think Barbara Hauser and Philippe Weil talk some about this. It's a master agreement that's written by the family for the family that talks about the rules and how the family operates. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly and get into the next area, which is the other big thing that these families do is they develop and that's a terrible outcome that every family wants to avoid. They can grow up and develop careers and go out. They can become artists. They can become organic farmers. They can become so connected, see and view the next generation. This is their product, and they want to develop the next generation, and they want the next generation to be committed to the family, or many of them, certainly the most talented, to have a connection to the family. So the four things that the families do are, first of all, they're engaged. They have family meetings every year. The family council and the different task forces and boards bring the generations together. So there are a lot of ways that the family does things together. Sometimes they take vacations together. They have a family ranch or a family house or family skiing vacations. They get to know each other, and they to care about each other. There's all transparency and about the business, about the enterprises. There are the families organize seminars. They have internships. There are different ways in which they bring the next generation into not just the business, but their activities. If they have a foundation, they may spend time visiting the people that the foundation has given to. If they have, if they're investors, they may share and teach and bring people to the businesses that they've invested in. So there's a lot of active sharing of information. Then the families focus on mentoring and development. They help each family member. They mostly pay for education. They want the next generation to travel and to study many times in other countries and other places. And they really want to develop the capability of the next generation. But finally, they, while it's okay if the next generation goes off and does, does something else, they want to create an opportunity to bring the next generation into the family. They want the next generation to say, well, even if I'm working outside, I'm a professor, I'm a whatever I am, I have time to be involved in the investment committee or the foundation, and I want to serve the family, and I want to come to family meetings. So these are the four things that these families talk about in the next generation. And this is a graphic of one family that has a whole process of different kinds of ways of educating and developing the next generation. And this family actually has a full-time person who's called the family relationship manager, who runs this whole thing for the 250 family members who are part of the family enterprise. So it can get very complicated. And these families have their own, sometimes they call it the family university, family education programs. Some other things that the families do is they take the family wealth and they, as part of the process of saying, what can we do with our wealth? They offer opportunities for the next generation to develop new ideas that the family can invest in. And sometimes they're business ideas, and these families start new businesses just as much as they develop their legacy businesses, but they might be social and enterprises that the philanthropic part of the family invests in, but they have a process for investing. They bring in other partners. And this is a way of inspiring and making sure that the next generation, as they have creative abilities and talents, that they can bring them back to the family. Another thing I learned from these families, which was I guess not what you'd expect, is I asked each family, think back to the major innovations and changes that you had as a family. How did they happen? Where did they originate? And 60% of the major innovations that created value, that really helped the family, came from the younger generation who were not formally named as to do it. They had a new idea. They had something that they learned in business school, something that inspired them, some values that they had. And they came to the family and said, I want to do something. I want to create a change. The creation of the family council is often the younger generation says, we want to get together and we want to meet as a family and we want to do things together. Family governance comes from that. Social enterprise comes from that. So a lot of families see leadership as coming from the younger generations, and unless they have a pathway and unless they respect the younger generations are just going to go away and say, hey, I've got talent, I got capability, you don't want it, I'm going to go do it somewhere else. And so by not encouraging innovation inside the family, they push innovative people and productive people out of the family. Final thing that these families do, and I think this is a whole area to talk about, is they invest in a shared future for their grandchildren. First of all, they do this by philanthropy, by giving to their community, and this is a way that they engage the family. But often the families begin to talk about the social responsibility and what are we investing in, and what is our business doing. So they begin to look at the social responsibility and sustainability of their businesses, and they get involved in that. And they look at impact investing. They look at investing and not just in things that are not harmful, but in things that are needed for the future of the planet. And these things might be seen as different to outsiders. Philanthropy is giving, impact investing is investing, social responsibility is corporate endeavor. But what's interesting is that the next generation members of this family find themselves connecting to the family, and they want to be part of the family because they get to do these activities in their family. And if the family doesn't share these values and doesn't want to do these things, then it's hard for them to bring in the next generation. And usually these kinds of initiatives come as much from the next generation as the older generation. So these are the things that families seem to have in common. I remember I talked to 100 families from 20 countries, and there were a lot of differences and a lot of ways in which the businesses were different. But these things, these themes, which are very, very powerful and very much about non-financial things, are the things that came across to me as what these families had in common. So this is a roadmap, and in the book, I have a lot of stories. The book tells the stories of people from these 100 families and the different kinds of ways in which the families went about these things, because even though there are common themes, every family went about it. So it's been a great journey, and I am absolutely awestruck by the fact that that the families share all of these things, and that family enterprise seems to be a way of being responsibly in business and create a wonderful future, not just for the family and for the business, but in the world. And so they're very inspiring to have met these families. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I love to hear from some of you. I guess I don't know whether we can turn on microphones or go in. into chat or what, but I'm going to
I'll
turn
leave this
off my.
question for you, Dennis. So guys, you have any questions, please put them in the chat window.
I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and gee, there's a lot of people here. Chat.
So audience, any questions?
Or people
please,
can unmute and ask.
Okay, I can see a question. Dennis, I'll just read it for you. Okay. So the first question is from Alan. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, great to be
Hello. Hi, Alan.
Hey,
Yeah.
Dennis, hey, how are you? Can you hear me okay?
Am I muted? No, I'm not. You're unmuted. I hear you, Alan.
You can hear me okay?
Yep, just talk louder.
Okay, Dennis, lovely to hear your presentation as always. And thanks for sharing. That's a fantastic piece of research that you've done. And I'm just curious in terms of if you saw any particular characteristics from different parts of the world in terms of some of the outcomes. So whether it be subcontinental or European or American, or even in our small part of the world here in Australia, New Zealand.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, I've given this talk about 30 or 40 times, and every single time I give the talk, that's the first question I get. It's really amazing. And so, yes, the 20 countries, every continent, every country has a different culture and a different way of expressing themselves in working together. And some families, like India, has a tradition of undivided family, but also a tradition of parental authority and hierarchy, and not a tradition of a lot of transparency. And these are cultural characteristics. So when I finished research, one of my co-researchers and I, who a lot of you may know, Jim Grubman, began to notice and say, well, what about the differences in culture? And so we together wrote a second book, and that book is called Cross Culture. And it's about the differences in global families. And we noticed a couple of things. One is that there are three broad cultural types in around the world. There's the Eastern, South Asian culture of harmony and respect for elders and tradition and kind of ambiguous communication and lack of conflict. There's the Western individualism that Barbara Hauser talked about in her rule of law presentation. And then there's a culture, an ancient culture, which is a kind of a tribal, a feudal culture where there is respect for the family and elders, but there's a distrust of the outside because the culture is unstable. And there's a sense of having to only trust people that you know and create alliances and have a strong hierarchy and obey the leaders, not because they're smart, but because they will protect you. And this is called the honor culture. And so these three cultures are common in different parts of the world. But what's happening now, and what we see even in the research, is that the people from one culture, for example, they send their kids to school, and the kids from kind of a Asian culture or from India, you'll go to school in the U.S. and they pick up individualistic Western values. Family members marry, family members travel together, they get to know each other. And so what we see is that despite all these cultural differences, which are in the older generations, the younger generations are becoming more alike and taking on the characteristics of the other culture. So what we have is a kind of a blending of cultures among the very wealthy. And we even go so far as to say, well, there's a kind of a culture of wealth that's global, that's somewhat different and separate than each of the family's original culture. When they become very wealthy, they become more global, they become more aware of other customs, they become aware that their cultural style is just a preference, it's not the only way to be, and so the culture begins to change. And I think the culture of these 100 families is really representing the beginning of this global blended family enterprise culture. A long answer, but there's a lot to say about cultural differences and how they work out in families across generations.
Thanks, Dennis. Much appreciated.
Here's a question which also comes up a lot. How do you make the first generation family understand the importance of setting up a family office? Well, what happens is the family office emerges from the business when you take wealth out and the family has significant wealth. And so the family begins to say, well, what do we do with it? And sometimes the people in the family say, we want to make our own decisions. We don't want to just get a large firm, a large bank, and invest it, even though they'll bring us a good return. We want to express who we are in our investments as well as our business. And very often, for example, family businesses say we want to invest and do deals with other family businesses or other families. And so they begin to see that the way to do that is through having a family office, either a single family office or a group of families. Sometimes they're creating a small family office for, like 10 or 20 families working together that share a set of values. So I think the way to learn about it, the families get interested in it, is they go to conferences and they meet other families. And they begin to, it isn't about should we do this, but it's an example of knowing what a family office can do for you and learning about what different family offices are doing around the world, because a family in India can be part of a family office anywhere. And so the globalization is entering the world of family offices. So the family office blends the family having control and their own personal identity with partnerships and connections with others. That's what the whole conference is about. So I can't give a complete answer. So here's one. India is young as far as family offices are concerned, more first generation patriarchs. How do we introduce the concept, the need for family enterprise as a path for the next generation? So this happens. A family office is started by the patriarch, and the patriarch is the family leader. And in a patriarchal family, this person therefore hires the family office staff, and they're his people. What happens is, as the person gets older and as the next generation gets older, is they begin to exert pressure. Sometimes family members begin to get involved when the older generation family office people are retiring and they want to bring in a new generation. And I've seen some young next generation groups say, we want to select the next person because we want this person to be our person. And there's a give and take in the family. Sometimes the family office has different parts, and the younger generation begins to have their own investment. They may have their own foundation. They may have a service center for next generation activities and education. It's part of the evolution process. It isn't a one-step process. It's a process of next generation becoming involved, next generation having a say, the family office differentiating and taking on more functions, and creating governance where, for example, the board of directors of a family office or the governing board begins to say, well, maybe we should have some members of the third generation who are now professionals in their own right. Maybe somebody should be on the board. And so they begin to bring new generation into governance. All kinds of ways that it happens. And it's, again, it's an evolution. Let's see. How families adhere to the family constitution over a period of time. So it's not a mere document. A lot of families, and I've even had calls from families that said, well, gee, we hired this law firm and they wrote us a family constitution and we have it and now we don't know how to do it. And so an agreement, even a legal agreement, no, there's not people watching over your shoulder to make sure you adhere to it. So along with the agreement, a family has to create a council and has to create a governing board to make the Constitution real. And one of the things that the governing board has to do is create some sort of a family dispute resolution thing when somebody doesn't adhere to it. One family I talked to had a huge ranch, and the brothers that ran the ranch were very, very large and cowboys. And they had in their family constitution, it said that every family member, because we're a ranch and we're on the land, every family member before they're 30 has to spend a full year working on the ranch. And I asked one of the brothers, so what happens if somebody says, well, I don't want to do it? And the brother said, well, I just look at him and it's a very big guy. I said, and I'd say, I think you ought to do it. And that's what moral authority is I don't know what would happen if a family member said, I'm not going to work on the ranch, but I'll bet it wouldn't be pleasant because the people in the family really believe that that's important. So their families have a conflict resolution process. They have a way of bringing in mediators. They have to have mechanisms for people that don't adhere to the rules.